Yeah, it was an amazing time to be there. Someone once told me you want to be in London in the even decades. It was amazing in the 60s, the 80s and the 90s, but super tough in the 70s, 90s and this decade just gone in the decades of austerity. Yeah, it was, amazing travel, amazing professional experience, amazing social experience. It was
Architects Abroad, a podcast brought to you by Brickworks Building Products.
G'day, I'm Tim Ross and welcome to Architects Abroad, a podcast for Brickworks Building Products. Travelling overseas is deeply embedded in the Australian psyche, and because of our relative isolation, we are drawn to exploring the world. We all know about the formative power of backpacking, but what about the vocational value of working overseas? What are the gains, both personal and professional, from time spent working abroad? In this podcast series, I talk to some of the best architects in the country to hear about their experiences working overseas and how it shaped both them and their practice. In this episode, I chat to Matthew Allen. Matty joined Bates Smart in 2009 and was made a director in 2017. His portfolio includes award-winning projects across many sectors, including residential, student housing, civic, hotel, and mixed-use schemes. A Melbourne boy, but now Sydney-based, we're about to find out how this affable architect ended up going overseas for a year and ended up being away for 9. In a rarity these days, we sat down face-to-face to have this chat. This is Matthew Allen. Matthew, good to see you. Thank you for coming into my house.
great to be here, Tim.
You're a Melbourne boy originally.
Yeah, I did. I grew up in Melbourne. Studied at Melbourne Uni in the late 90s.
So you're Melbourne, and then you, like most Australians, in some shape or form, you're drawn to London. What was it for you?
I'm actually I'm pretty hard to dislodge from places. It was my wife that gave me the kick up the bum. Well, my now wife that gave me the kick up the bum to go to London. So,
what'd she say?
Well, she said, "I'm going. You can come if you want to." So she actually moved over there 3 months before I finished uni. So I packed up and moved over as soon as I'd finished at Melbourne Uni and sort of took the first job I could get there, which turned out to be a pretty good experience. Not my first choice practice, but I got a really great opportunity to follow a project from master plan through to completion.
And where was that?
The company's called RMJM. They were a sort of old, important mid-century Scottish practice that I guess the profile of the firm had dwindled a little bit in that time. They at the time I was there, they were the executive architect on the Scottish Parliament building, but that was being done out of the Edinburgh office, and we were doing a bit of education and commercial work in the London office while I was there. I worked on a project in Kent, a new university campus where the universities of Kent and Greenwich were coming together in an old naval heritage precinct.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, it was.
This is 2002-ish, and
2002 to 2004. That was. So it was in the boom times of London.
Yeah. So it was easy to hook into work and.
Yeah, it was. It was an amazing time to be there. Someone once told me you want to be in London in the even decades. It was amazing in the 60s, the 80s, and the 90s, but super tough in the 70s, 90s, and this decade just gone. In the decades of austerity. Yeah, it was, amazing travel, amazing professional experience, amazing social experience. It was.
And how long did you think you were going to go for?
Like most Aussies, I packed a 20 kilo backpack and was expecting to be there for a year or two. Came back 9 years later with 14 cubic metres in a container.
So after the first year, what made you stay? What was happening?
It was, I think part of it was the contrast between the experience as a student, which was my most recent experience in Melbourne, and my first real full-time professional job that comes with free weekends, opportunities to travel, much more opportunity to socialise with a broader group of people. And I just really got caught up in that. The work was fun. The travel was great. And we were living life large, I'd say.
And what was what drew you to your next job?
So, as the project in Kent was coming to an end, I realised, look, I've got to really set up my career here. So I took a lot of time to research a range of different practices, and ultimately targeted AHMM, Alford Hall Monaghan Morris, who at that time were,
Hard to remember every member of them for a while.
Yeah.
Is
is the acronym.
How do they answer the phone there?
Alford Hall Monaghan Morris.
Oh, they do?
Yeah, the whole mouthful. They had a great emerging portfolio in housing at a range of different scales: houses, multi-residential, mixed tenure, social affordable, student housing, master planning. And I'd set my heart on trying to really understand housing at all its different levels. It was something I was interested in at uni, but I hadn't done much of in that first job at RMJM. So I got a job there. They were a sort of growing mid-sized practice, first generation firm set up by the 4 founding directors. It was about 15 years prior to me joining. There were about 70 people there. They've gone on to become one of the biggest practices and most successful of the current generation.
That was mostly to you, I presume.
Yeah, yes. Huge contribution, huge. So now I think they're about 350 people working pretty much in London, in the UK, with a little office in Bristol and one in Oklahoma, of all places.
The idea of housing in London obviously significantly different to how, certainly in those days of the early 2000s, most Australians were still looking at living in terms of apartment living.
Mm.
How did you find that, and what did you have to offer in terms of an Australian outlook when it came to designing these places?
I mean, the UK has there's a strong history in housing design manuals and codified systems. There's been a lot more housing delivered by government over the decades, and as a result, space standards and minimum controls were a bigger influence at that time than anything I'd experienced. What I'd learned in architecture school was about the human experience, livability, access to sunlight and daylight, a connection to outdoors. Some things to do with the Australian environment, but others simply to do with, I guess, the architectural proposition rather than the economic proposition. And once you get into larger multi-residential projects, master planning, housing to some extent is designed by, it's about creating spaces for people and so on, but you also need to grapple with the numbers of the economic numbers. And so my first taste of that was on some of those larger scale projects in the UK, and understanding that housing is a it's a basic human need, but it's also the building blocks of our cities, and it's also an investment vehicle, and it operates on many, many different levels. I think the breadth of different types of housing in the UK, particularly at that time with investment in mixed tenure, was a real eye opener.
And in terms of those projects, like Adelaide Wharf is one of those ones where you've got social housing and non-social housing together. Does it work, or what? And it's essentially you're delivering the same housing.
Yeah. Ultimately, I mean, there's some minor differences that are driven by. So social housing, which is owned by the council or the government or whatever, a lot of the decisions around the design of that are about long-term maintenance and turnover of residents in a kind of 3 to 5 to 10 year window, whereas market housing is driven by the point of design decisions around market housing. A lot of those are driven by the point of sale and having an amazing offering to pitch to potential purchasers. Build to rent, which is just coming in now, is another a kind of hybrid of those two, where you've got developers that are now interested in ongoing maintenance, replacement, ease of moving people in and out, a range of different issues that are the driver of a lot of the design decisions. I mean, all of them obviously have to deal with being a great place to live.
But you've got two apartments side by side, and so, you know, little Brian goes over to see his mate Jimmy.
Yeah.
You've got different taps to me, Jimmy. Why is that? Is it?
It's different floors.
It's different.
Different floors and different bench tops.
The Olympic Village Master Plan. Tell me about working on that in London.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting one. We were doing that work for Lendlease of all companies who were moving into the UK at that time, an Australian company originally. I've worked for them here obviously too, and that was it was part of at the point we got involved, the games had been awarded to London. Stratford City had been identified as the location of the games, and there was a sort of semi-developed master plan for this Lee Valley precinct. So we worked with Lendlease to help restructure that residential precinct to accommodate the athletes on site in the first place, and then turn it into a mixed tenure housing precinct.
I was reading on something here from one of your pieces where you'd said that the challenge was to create a building where athletes could have sex with each other, and then it would be a great place for people to live afterwards.
Yeah, it involved tearing down walls and putting them back up.
I mean, it is funny, isn't it, this idea that, you know, it has a 4-week lifespan for its original use.
Yeah.
And so when you look at, you know, Olympic housing, how much is on the future and how much of it's on that 4 weeks?
Well, I've only been involved in the London one, so I can't speak for all, but our experience there was we designed it first and foremost as the legacy mode. So what did it look like as a residential precinct in 2014 after the Olympics were gone, and with an eye to how it can be made as efficient as possible to accommodate as many athletes who aren't going to spend more than 2 weeks there.
Yeah,
and probably going to be out partying most of the time.
Once they come last in the high jump, and then it's all over in the first week.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting process where we sort of set up the framework for the village without doing any of the kind of detailed architectural expression. It was planning and feasibility and so on. And then Lendlease ran a process where they developed a pool of different, there was I think 11 or 12 different architects selected in a pool to each contribute to parts of different buildings. And so they went through with the detailed design, building on the framework that we'd established. And it was a really interesting collaborative process. It's got, if you go there, it's got a bit of a homogeneity to it because it was all built at once. And it doesn't have, you know, some of the layer and texture of the older neighbourhoods of London, but we did work hard to give it a sense of the mansion block streets of London at that kind of 6 to 8 story street scale, with streets designed for pedestrians and yeah, despite it being a contemporary construction that doesn't have all of that richness of the older neighbourhoods, I'm really proud of the outcome as a piece of, you know, urban fabric.
I like it when people are proud of things. It's really good. I mean, what an experience to be doing all these things. And let's talk about your life. You know, you actually travelled on weekends, and lots of people said they would do that, but you did that.
Certainly did.
And, you know, I'm romanticising that you're smashing pints after work with all your new friends and talking about architecture in the world.
Yeah, I did. I actually, a couple of years ago, found a photo of myself on the website of one of the pubs I did used to smash pints in midweek. It was a bit of a shock.
And so and you're having a great time. That's 7 years.
Yeah.
What brings you home?
Well, the GFC hit, obviously.
Oh, that was a bit of a bummer, wasn't it?
Sort of towards the end of the decade. I blame it on my wife again, really. She had a great job offer here. She took a redundancy in the UK, had a great job offer in Sydney. We'd never really actively decided to move permanently to London. We drifted along there. and we ultimately decided, look, let's go back to Australia. We'll have a couple of years in Australia, and if we don't like it, we can always come back to London. We discussed at length about where in Australia we should move to, and ultimately decided on Sydney to try something new again.
It's very common for Melbourne people who have been away for a while to choose Sydney.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had quite a few friends in London from Melbourne who moved back to Melbourne, and I feel like they struggled with on some level a sense of going backwards in their lives, whereas I never felt a moment of that. Coming to Sydney was a new place, didn't know anyone, or knew a handful of people, no preconceptions about what the industry was like, what sort of architecture happened here, and really I've loved it from day one. And
you landed Bates Smart very quickly.
Yeah, it was pretty quick.
Good job.
Yeah, growing up in Melbourne, I obviously knew Bates Smart, but it was a kind of different firm when I was in Melbourne in the 90s. I mean, we were working on Fed Square at that time. That was probably the most high profile project where we were in collaboration with Lab Architecture Studio. But it was sort of before the current generation of renewal had really kicked off. And I certainly in Sydney, I didn't have any preconceptions about the practice, but I've always been interested in enduring architecture, and I think thinking back to my time at university and in Melbourne, I really felt that I was studying at a time where there were two quite distinct schools of architecture. There was the kind of post-Corrigan school coming focused around RMIT, and Melbourne Uni where I studied was seen as, more historically oriented, more conservative, you might say. I felt a real affiliation for that, and I got to say I struggled a bit with this kind of divided profession where on some level there was one school really focused on a approach to architecture and another school that was focused on another approach. I feel certainly since I've restarted my career in Sydney, I've felt a much greater sense of camaraderie around many different approaches to architecture than the kind of dual approach in Melbourne at that time.
When you came back, what was it that the experiences that you had in London that suddenly you could bring into your new role at Bates Smart?
It's hard to differentiate between the things that were just natural career progression and things that were specific to the experience in London. I certainly brought back a passion for housing, having worked on a broad range of different housing types, and was keen to get involved in apartment projects in the early days. I think I was in London at a time where brick had made a big
how did that happen?
Resurgence. It's hard. It's really hard to pinpoint. I think there was certainly a rise in the importance of contextualism and craft in architecture in that building boom of the 2000s. There was often a lot of pressure there's pressure to build buildings quickly and cheaply, and the London stock brick was the cheapest good quality material that was available. And so you walk around London today and you see building after building built out of that sort of fuzzy yellow brick, done by countless architecture practices. It really was the kind of building block of that boom. Some might say that's made a homogenous, uninteresting city. I say it's made, it's the background. It's made all the great background buildings of that generation. The ones, since Grenfell, obviously, the folly of trying to do it even cheaper out of composite panels been demonstrated in a horrifying way. But I think brick as a, it stood the test of time as a great material for city building.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about it, my mind obviously goes to those moments in London where there are those newer buildings for the last 15 years, and it to me it symbolises the excitement of those new areas of London.
That's good to hear, because I equally to me it feels like they're the next chapter in an evolving history of a never-ending evolution of a great city like London. It is exciting. It is exciting.
Does London feel like a second home to you?
Look, it did for a long time. I'm starting to feel, 10 or 11 years on now, I'm starting to feel a bit more distance from it. I went back there just at the start I was there in early March, just as COVID was settling in.
Good timing. Came home okay.
Got out of there, came home to home isolation. But yeah, it was. It definitely felt like a holiday in a different place for the first time. There's more parts of the city that you don't know each time you go back to a place. I feel each trip I felt more and more like a visitor. It's a place I will continually return to.
You are listening to Architects Abroad, a podcast for Brickworks Building Products. If you want to see any of the projects mentioned in this podcast, head to the gallery at the Brickworks YouTube channel. What's important why is it important for Australian architects to work overseas, and what do you gain from it?
Look, it was important to me just to see a range of, get exposed to a range of different perspectives. So, look, London's not the most adventurous of places for an Australian architect to go. It's same language, same historical culture to a large extent. It's sort of easier to transition into it because of that. But it does have a very strong connection to Europe, or it did when I was there. We'll see what happens post-Brexit. I think it certainly allowed me to travel and see a lot of the buildings designed by some of my architecture heroes. Like I will never forget the Alvar Aalto pilgrimage through Finland I did with 3 other architects. It was my biggest architecture geek out I've ever done. Yeah. 4 days of going from building to building to building without my non-architect wife who gets me into more museums than building visits. But it was that off to Spain every time I could to see a range of different architects. That access to experiencing all those things firsthand, having a little longer to dwell there, really understand those buildings rather than rushing through on a backpacking holiday. I think it's been a big influence. And just, I think also London in particular is a very slow profession by comparison to Australia. When we moved back, I was absolutely shocked how quickly we moved through concept design phase, get a DA lodge, get that approved and get it built. Like I'd had 3 buildings built in 7 years in the UK. And
welcome to Sydney. Let's get it through, boys. Let's get it through.
Exactly. It was really surprising. Anyway, the slower pace, more deliberative process, I think helps you find your own space to contribute meaningfully to the design process.
Tell me about the Kensington Colleges at University of New South Wales.
So that was a great, really amazing project. We won it in a kind of competitive tender process where we were working with a builder during the competition phase. So they had 6 consortia bid. So the first meeting I remember during the bid phase, we had a six-week design period. The builder said, right, we're going to build this out of brick. that's the way it's going to be. And so that competition process was driven by the desire to do a great brick building right from the outset. And so from early on, and I think at every stage of the design process, we just explored how could the brickwork contribute to this. It's an important material to the campus. The project includes the retention of a mid-century dining hall, which had won the Sulman Medal, which used this richly textured clinker brick. So we were exploring blending. It was a sort of early project in the use of blending of the current cycle of buildings, where we ended up using 3 different face bricks did mock-up panels of countless sizes to get that right, and then using coloured glazed brick to really inject a bit of personality into each of the colleges. The project as a whole brought together 5 different colleges, so we're using those different colours to help each of the buildings be subtly different from one another in a pretty basic way. But yeah, worked really closely with the Brickworks team to customize the color of those glaze to work with the existing identity of the different colleges. And it's got a bit of a kind of joyful feel. Some of those richer colors near the ground plane that I think is an interesting response in the university environment.
Is there a vastly different approach to how you would design for students today than they would have for colleges 50 years ago in terms of what a kid needs, in terms of a bed and some PowerPoints?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the interesting things about the Kensington Colleges project was we were rebuilding 3 of the colleges which had been on campus since the 50s and 60s. So they had their identity existing already. A whole lot of how do I describe it? The rituals for the students that they wanted to be ported into this new college. And what you do find in most student housing today is ensuite bathrooms in every room. 50 years ago, you had the group showers down the end of the corridor. One of the interesting things about the brief is there was an element of both. A lot of there were smaller rooms without en-suites where communal bathrooms were provided for those students, and there were some which had en-suites. So it's a bit more choice, and a bit more of the history could be carried through into the modern facility. So that was a kind of older feature of the buildings that was carried through specifically to talk to that time gone by, because it was such an important ritual of the college that had existed.
They're such strange places, I think, because they are temporary homes.
Yeah.
So you're in and they're there, and then suddenly they're empty.
Yeah.
And
it's odd, and they're temporary homes for young adults who are some of the most passionate, involved people that are out there. But vulnerable too, and so to get the right balance between supporting that vitality of their lives, but having enough pastoral care, enough social spaces, and so on, to really support their life in a proper way is something the building can contribute to.
Final question for you, Matthew. If there's one thing you value from working overseas, what is it?
I think it's the opportunity to collaborate and work with people and processes that are unfamiliar to you, to, I guess, soak up the influences of others. And I think the more culturally diverse those experiences are, I guess, the more opportunity you have to soak up difference.
Excellent. Great final answer. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Tim. Pleasure.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming out to the house.
Cheers.
You've been listening to Architects Abroad, which is a podcast series presented by Brickworks Building Products. If you'd like to see any of the projects mentioned in this podcast, head to the gallery at the Brickworks YouTube channel. I'm Tim Ross. Thanks so much for listening.